Thanks, folks. It's great to be here. Great to see you. Thanks for coming. Before I make my introduction of our first keynote, may I call your attention to the fact that our very fine caterer, Sarah, misplaced her cell phone somewhere, likely in this room or perhaps in a crevice. Would you keep your eyes open? She said it's in a small leather type packet or holder. Just let me know if you happen to find her cell phone. She'd be tickled pink, needless to say. Well, in May of this year, I was reading Rotary magazine. And at that time, we'd already begun the planning process under the leadership of Tim Wellman and Charlotte Ream. And we were working on this idea of impact, as Tim has nicely outlined it, and the word cloud idea. And that was already bubbling. At that same time, as I was reading Rotary magazine and thinking about the plans for this symposium, by very good coincidence, or maybe it was fate, I came across this article. And here's the gentleman that was featured in the article. Tusu Tusubira, very prominently featured. And of course, as you can see, as I hold this up, increase our impact. I put 2 and 2 together, came up with 4, and thought, right, Bob? This was brilliant arithmetic on my part, and came up with the idea that we might invite him as a guest keynoter to this conference. So I'm delighted the article appeared because it lays out his leadership in this area. He is an international leader within Rotary from Uganda. Let me just tell you a couple of things about Tusu. He has international experience in policy analysis and formulation, capacity building, and research. He's one of the founding partners of Knowledge Consulting Limited. In Rotary International and for Rotary International, he served and continues to serve in various capacities at local, regional, and international levels. He's also a member in Uganda and elsewhere of many different boards and boards of directors. His talk today focus on designing projects for sustainable impact. So with no further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our Ugandan friend and international Rotarian, Tusu Tusubira.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very extremely kind introduction, I should actually say. And Rotarians, Rotractors, friends and family of Rotary, I'm really honored by this invitation to share on sustainable impact. This is an area I've been interested in both professionally and as a volunteer for a long time. Now, sustainable impact is, however, a very, very wide area. And therefore, for our conversation today, we shall focus on only 5 themes. The first one is appreciating the importance of starting with the end in mind. We shall then see why systemic change requires systemic intervention. Third, we shall be looking at how to identify and understand the gaps, the assumptions, and the risks in our program logic in order to improve project design. Fourth, we shall see that any community intervention should never be approached as a once-off standalone, but as an opportunity for learning from successes and failures and possibly guiding scaling up. And then finally, the last thing we shall be talking about is that sustainable impact requires behavioral change. Now, of course, I do appreciate that because of accent differences, you might miss some of the words, but I've also shared the paper with the organizers, which means that later on, you'll be able to read it in full. So just sit back and see what comes up. I have been honored for a long time. Rotary has given me the opportunity to participate in driving change so that our great organization can adapt to the rapidly evolving times along with addressing the related challenges that appear to have the nature of the mythical multi-headed hydra. You cut off one head and two new heads appear. We have learned through research and evaluating grant models we use in Rotary that our organizational existence requires new approaches to conceptualizing and implementing service projects, which are the core of our existence. We have learned and none more than in the fight to eradicate polio that we need partnerships. Just like Hachus needed the support of his nephew to kill the hydra. We have learned also that the partners we cultivate, and especially the younger generations of Rotarians, need evidence of impact in order to give the Rotary Foundation much needed financial support. And then Polio Plus has, of course, taught us that any major program, the kind that current global challenges demand of Rotary, must have a long-term view. And I know one of these is definitely the WASH area. The days of quick fixes through matching grants are long gone, colleagues, mainly because the quick fixes, while creating emotional satisfaction for us as Rotarians, never really worked. These earlier grant models, however, provided lessons that were the takeoff point for the global grants we now run. We learned the importance of looking at long-term outcomes or impact instead of simply counting outputs. Colleagues, the graveyard of thousands of matching grant projects taught us that sustainability, and I'm glad it is becoming a dominant word in the word cloud, sustainability must be a key consideration at the design stage of any project. We have also learned that continuing research and evaluation of grant models is a critical ongoing activity alongside the other things we do with respect to grants. And based on the learning from global grants, we now have programs of scale, requiring us to shift conceptualization of community interventions to an even higher level, and in the process, acquiring knowledge that can be applied to smaller grants. There is, however, a big gap, colleagues, between agreeing on research-driven change at the strategic level on one hand, and on the other hand, changing the approaches to designing and implementing community interventions as Rotarians and Rotary clubs. The first thematic area under our strategic plan, increasing our impact, cannot be achieved until we change our approaches. And change cannot happen until we understand the why of the change, the implications of the change, and indeed how we can change our approaches. And therefore, we need to develop a new language in order to leave our past behind, taking on only the lessons we have learned forward. Now, colleagues, we are not alone in taking this path. As I'm sure many of you or all of you might know, the Strategic Initiative Task Force of Rotary is developing ways to incorporate research, monitoring, and evaluation into the projects that Rotary clubs and districts carry out in their own communities and in their districts. The initiative has identified 4 major challenges that impede our progress. First, the reality that Rotary has not yet embraced a data-driven culture. And yet members and participants, especially the funding agencies and some of expert partners, the NGOs we work with, increasingly want to see evidence-based, locally driven service projects that generate practical learning on the one hand, and then clear, tangible outcomes and impact on the other hand. Second, and this goes back to the need to change everything about Rotary, our current technical infrastructure hobbles Rotary by trapping data, service project data, in systems and formats from yesterday. This then makes it impossible to track, to analyze, and share learning and insights at scale, or indeed access data we need to make strategic decisions and design more effective projects. Third, we don't have a shared understanding of impact measurement concepts and approaches. And without a common language, a common vision and a common language, it is hard to establish standard measures and practices to identify effective methodologies or to create practical tools for what we want to achieve. And then the fourth, and this is part of our heritage, colleagues, many of us comfortable in our altruistic hearts believe that doing the work is more important than talking about it. But if we do not document and communicate service project results, both successes and failures, others cannot build on our learning and achievements, and we actually risk repeating failures. It limits our ability to grow and scale and hampers efforts to bring in new members and partners. Rotarians, these challenges are the opportunity we must seize to take Rotary to a new and high level of performance. The question is, how can we do this? First, we should always start with the end in mind when designing any community intervention. Starting with the end in mind requires us to shift our thinking from what we do to why we do. In the days of matching grants, we would find a community without potable water and provide a borehole. We would find another community without a health center and put up one. The question is, did these interventions benefit the communities? It was not possible to answer this question because success was taken to mean that the borehole or health center had been set up. Benefit was assumed, but it was not a design objective. The design objectives were the outputs. Colleagues, just like we do in our businesses, we need to be able to respond to the question, what will success look like in the long term from our community interventions? Going back to our borehole example and approaching it from the why perspective, we can see the sequence of logic as we move from the borehole to a higher level of impact in the community. Why a borehole? Access to potable water. We all know that. We are Welsh people. Why potable water? It improves community health. But then we want to take it higher. Why improved health? Because the community is going to have more time for income-generating activities. Why income-generating activities? Because this leads to economic well-being. Why economic well-being? So that maybe they can take children to school to acquire a proper education. Why a proper education? And we say that based on evidence, this links positive impact on human development and an improved quality of life. So we see the shift, colleagues, that when we take the why approach, the achievement of improved human development and a better quality of life is the end objective. This is the end the project should be designed for. We should note that this shifts from things being given to the community to the long-term state of the community. The second theme addresses designing interventions for systemic change. Our colleagues, about 30 years ago, as a fairly young, a much younger cadre member, I was invited to conduct a post-evaluation of a water project in the Nandi Hills in Kenya. It had been noted some years earlier that there was a high incidence of eye disease in the area. The Rotary Doctor Bank of Sweden was sending volunteer eye doctors every year to treat eye disease. It took some cycles of intervention before it was realized that the source of infection was actually the water. And therefore, to address eye disease, they worked with the District 2390 in Sweden to set up a string of boreholes. Now, this changed the intervention from disease treatment to disease prevention. And this is when I started appreciating that carrying out an immediate intervention to address an immediate and visible community need, the kind of approach that the entire Rotary world had long been conditioned to, did not necessarily address the underlying causes. It only reduced the headache. And therefore, repeated quick fix interventions do not lead to sustainable impact. Indeed, this is precisely why the Rotary Foundation shifted the approach from doing a community needs assessment, which was limited to what we see as needs, to the more holistic community assessment, taking into account the strengths and everything on which you can build in the intervention. Now, using the example of borehole now, and just looking at that string, it is evident that we have a lot more than potable water to consider in order to achieve the final why of our intervention, which is improved human development and a better quality of life. Access to potable water will reduce the incidence of a group of diseases, but a holistic intervention around health will be needed to reduce the overall incidence of disease. Now, this then introduces a new set of interventions related to health. It is in order to achieve reduced incidence of disease. Now, that in turn can then lead to the other short-term outcome, having more time for income-generating activities. However, having more time for income-generating activities does not necessarily mean that the community can and will take on income-generating activities in order to enable better economic well-being. The community needs to develop awareness, business acumen, improved skills, financial literacy, and all these introduce another set of required interventions. Now, taking children to school does not necessarily mean that they'll have a better education. Those schools must have good teachers with good teacher skills, management skills, business acumen, and and scholastic materials. Now, this introduces a third set of required interventions. And therefore, colleagues, we see that starting with this very simple example, it will take a lot more than simply potable water to achieve the long-term outcome. We need a holistic approach, which is implicit in the community assessment template. The challenges any community faces are interconnected, and they compound each other. And therefore, addressing a single challenge rarely achieves the kind of long-term impact, sustainable impact that we need to achieve. And therefore, we need to appreciate that systemic change demands systemic interventions. The hydra cannot be killed by chopping off one head at a time. Now, this example, to which there is really much more than is highlighted here, also tells us that even if we are specialists in one area, we shall need to bring on board other skill sets that can enable us to address the different interventions in order to achieve systemic, sustainable impact. And this actually underscores the importance of cooperating organizations. Now, our third theme addresses assumptions, one of the biggest gaps in our community interventions. Colleagues, we make assumptions all the time, consciously or subconsciously, about the outcomes of an activity we undertake. This could be switching lanes on a highway to get faster to your destination. And we all know that Murphy's Law always kicks in, and you find that the lane has got the slow-moving truck ahead. Unfortunately, we rarely time to think and identify the assumptions we make, and are surprised or indeed shocked when the assumptions, putting it politely, bite us in our seating facilities. Each assumption points to a weak point, a likely point of failure, a risk we must plan for. As another example, and going back again to providing a borehole, what kind of assumptions have we made around it? That the community will have access to the borehole, that they can maintain a clean water chain from drawing to consumption, that the borehole be properly maintained, that there is easy and affordable access to maintenance services. The community is willing and able to pay user fees. They will have access to resources and expertise to replace the borehole in some years, or indeed drill more boreholes for a growing population, and so on and so forth. All these are assumptions, and these are about borehole. I've not talked about health or education or economic well-being. all of them come with their sets of assumptions. The assumptions around all these point to the gaps and the risks the community engagement or intervention will run into. Identifying risks at the design stage enables us to include other necessary activities to close the gaps long before we start implementing. And this improves the likelihood of achieving sustainable impact. Now, the fourth theme addresses approaching any community intervention as a learning opportunity. We are all familiar with herd immunity with respect to disease prevention. With the same frame of thinking, this actually applies to any community or country or region where an intervention of whatever nature is implemented. We have, for example, learned from Polio Plus that only total elimination of polio will produce a polio-free world. Similarly, access to clean water will not have national impact, or will have national impact only if the intervention reaches a minimum majority of the population. We cannot talk about improved health in a community when only 5% of that community is benefiting. This means then that any project or program we design and implement for the first time is only the first trial phase. An opportunity to identify what works and why, and what does not work and why not, and what aspects indeed are scalable. While such a project may be judged to be successful at the micro level, the effort is largely wasted if it is not designed or scaled for scalable impact. Even our first program of scale, and I'm sure you have all heard about Partners for a Malaria-Free Zambia, will sooner than later face the reality that mosquitoes, which carry the malaria parasite, do not respect national boundaries. And therefore, you have to deal with Malawi, with Zimbabwe, with Angola, with the DRC, and it keeps on expanding. And therefore, you find that a malaria-free Zambia means probably a malaria-free Africa before that can be achieved. And therefore, learning requires that we step back from our pet theories, and we all have pet theories as Rotarians, and assumptions, and really test them by identifying those indicators that can convincingly tell the story, and that we make modifications to our methodologies if they do not achieve the planned results. A follow-up project will then test the design further because it brings on board the learning from the first one. Everything is a learning experience. The increasing our impact thematic area specifically states that we need to improve our ability to achieve and measure impact. And I'll quote Lord Kelvin here, the British physicist, that if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. And therefore, measuring impact should be considered at the design stage. It calls for the identification of indicators that will be utilized to measure and track progress at the outcome and impact levels. Such indicators need to be baselined right from the start. And the Rotary Foundation trustees, recognizing this, have allowed 10% of any grant for monitoring and evaluation. The unfortunate footnote to this is that the Rotary Foundation monitoring and evaluation template only gives outputs as indicators. Now, learning also requires that we develop a tolerance for and acceptance of failure. We need to share our failures, as this is the basis for further learning and improvement. As an engineer, I know that we learn more from what has failed than from what has worked. It is my view that success hides mistakes and failure reveals those mistakes so that we can then deal with them. Indeed, organizations that will thrive the fourth industrial revolution and beyond are those for which there's no point of arrival with respect to learning, innovation, and improvement of products. And in our case, this is our service offerings, must respond to or indeed stay ahead of rapidly evolving circumstances and challenges. Now, recognizing each project as a learning activity rather than a once-off standalone creates the opportunity to scale. The approach used in Rotary's programs of scale grants builds on the scope, impact, and sustainability of successful Rotary service projects that can support long-term undertakings. They empower Rotary members to work with experienced partners to increase the impact of proven approaches. Colleagues, I think it's actually paradoxical that in our businesses and vocations, we consider learning from our successes and failures as critical for improved performance. And yet we tend to set it aside as Rotarians in community interventions. What we learn in our businesses and vocations enables us to scale up. No one runs a business without the desire for growth. We need to bring this same ethos to community interventions. The fifth and last theme is appreciation that sustainable impact is built on behavioral change among the beneficiaries. The Rotary Foundation defines sustainability as the likelihood that a program's impact will continue long after grant funding is spent through the continuation of the services that the program offered. Now let's consider, for example, a community where people are accustomed to collecting water from a natural open well or stream. Now, you colleagues are very familiar with this. The waterborne diseases, along with all the consequences, would be an accepted and inevitable part of community life. When a borehole is provided to such a community, a consumption fee is normally required to ensure that they can sustain the infrastructure. Now, as a cadre member, I have been to many such installations where most of the community prefer getting their water from the free natural sources, even when such sources are further away. This will happen even if awareness has been built as part of the implementation. I've seen this many times in projects we have run ourselves. And therefore, we face a challenge here. However, you always find some early adapters. And over time, awareness starts to permeate that those people in families who get water from the boreholes fall sick less often. And then those early adapters start seeing that the money they spend on getting water from the borehole is a lot less than what they were spending on treating disease before. This awareness is the first change, the first marker that the behavior of the community is beginning to change. Eventually, people become more and more willing to pay for the water, rather pay the user fee, so that the services can be maintained. That is another behavior change marker. Over time, the entire community will become habituated to utilizing clean water. And when that happens, then you find that the drive to have potable water comes from within the community and its leadership and its resources. And we can then talk about sustainable impact because the community now owns the potable water challenge. This is the final behavioral marker. Colleagues, it is this behavior change that is at the heart of sustainability in any intervention, small or large. I personally like to say that sustainable impact is achieved when appreciation of the benefits of the intervention among the beneficiaries has increased to a level where they are willing and able to ensure continuity based on internal to the community leadership and resources. That is sustainability. Now, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to reiterate as we conclude our 5 themes, but this time formulated as a set of reflective questions. Number 1, what are the long outcomes relating to the state of the community that you want to achieve? Are your planned activities sufficient to achieve these outcomes? If not, what other major interventions are required alongside your initial concept? Which partners do you need to support you in all this? And then second, are there reasonable logical connections linking the activities you plan and the achievement of your long-term outcomes? Does experience or other evidence back up your thinking? Third, what assumptions have you made? What are the risks and what changes are required in the project design to address such risks? Number 4, which indicators will you use to evaluate outcomes and impact? What can you and the Rotary world learn through this project during its implementation? What do you need to understand to know if it might work in another context or at a larger scale? And finally, what behavioral change is necessary among the program participants to achieve sustainable impact? And how will you measure and track it? Do the project planned activities lead to this? Ladies and gentlemen, the challenge we collectively face as Rotarians and as Rotary clubs, as Rotary leaders and as Rotary staff, is that we have a long history of giving things. While we talk about change and increasing our impact at the strategic level, nothing much is changing because our mindset has not yet changed. Like the community that used to collect water from an open natural spring or well, we need to change attitude and behavior to take our act to the next level where we can design projects not just for sustainable impact, but for sustainable impact at scale. Thank you, Rotarians, for the time and for listening to me. Thank you. Over to you, Session Chair.
Thank you, Tusu, for that inspiring presentation. And I'm privileged to lead a brief Q&A session. Some of his most important points, among the many, I like the way Tusu asks a series of why questions. Yes, we're interested in what, we're interested in how, we're interested in when. He asks a series of why questions and sequentially places them out there. I think that's extremely innovative and helpful. Another thing that struck me again, he reminds us to consider and reconsider the assumptions behind our projects and longer-term programs. To do a tough evaluation of those assumptions. Of course, he stresses leading toward community ownership of a project or of a program, the true community ownership, not just a token statement. These are very powerful points that I believe Tusu shared with us. And I like how he began with this simple, seemingly simple, borehole example. I think that's a terrific way to do it. So congratulations, Tusu, on the way you shared that. I really liked it. Then, of course, definable long-term outcomes. How do we define them? How do we wrestle with them with our partners? What are the indicators? What are the specific quantitative and qualitative indicators? Those are some of the things that struck me from Tusu's presentation. What comments or questions or critiques do we have from folks here or online? Please, is it Roger?
Trying to accomplish in the lives of our students, that this introductory material is being taught to them in the first place. And that's a hard thing to get people to move to the end results of what you want at the personal and community level. And this model is terrific, but maybe he could share one or two of those heads that on the hydra that keeps popping back up over and over again.
So Tusu, would you like to tackle that?
The question was a bit faint. Could you please echo it for me?
In terms of the blocks of moving to this really end result type of thinking, what are the problems? I said the heads of the Hydra. What are the problems that come out over and over and over again to get the thinking to move down to the what is the final purpose of this work?
Okay. I believe one of the heads which I've seen in very many places, including our own projects in Kampala North, my club, we do a lot of projects, is that we sometimes get very impatient in terms of progress. While it is very easy to do the infrastructure in a very short time, changing the mindset of the community is a much longer term effort. And therefore, you find that you have done maybe a wonderful WASH project, and for the first 6 months, everything looks good. You go back 2 years later, and we do that because we're in the localities, and then you find that things have been neglected or broken down or just owned, the borehole is taken over by the person who had the land, and so on and so forth. So I think the first thing is that we need to learn patience in dealing with communities. The number two is the assumption we always make that this is going to sound strange, that poor communities are poor. Poor communities appear poor because we don't normally take the time to look for the resources within the community, which the community assessment talks about. Because the idea about finding the strengths in a community is getting a foundation on which to build success. If we get mired in the needs, it's like putting a house, well, in quicksand, if you like. And therefore, that's the other aspect, that a community right from the word go must be willing to invest themselves in an intervention. If they don't, then it is not going to be sustained. I have a picture somewhere which I didn't share today. Long ago, this was the Maasai Wells project, a major project, and I've got a picture of the Maasai digging a trench for the pipe. Even that is a contribution, and people feel that they own the project. So those are two heads I can mention to that question. Others keep on coming up. So you think that, I'll give one more, especially in poorer communities, especially those which are male-dominated, you might find that increased wealth is for the benefit of the head of the house, who is normally the man, rather than the overall benefit of the community. And that has got to be addressed again through a mindset change, which takes time. I hope those are enough heads for you to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks, Tusu, and thanks, Roger. That heads of the Hydra metaphor is quite a powerful and interesting and stimulating one. Chris is our next questioner.
Yes, Tusu, my name is Chris Roselle. I'm pleased to meet you. Thank you for speaking with us. I've had the pleasure of working with partners in Yumbe and Arua and Lira, Uganda. Tusu, some of my questions are, in water, what are you looking at measuring? Some of the things that I've tried to measure are the impact on the second major cause of infant and child death in Uganda, diarrhea. Another thing is the amount of water. Another thing is whether they have all the services, whether they're collecting fees or not to maintain them. Have you found instruments? Have you found practices that both the community and we learn from to maintain, especially water sanitation and hygiene better? Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Chris. I was looking at a theory of change template developed by the European Union sometime, and you have raised some very pertinent questions. So I gave the example of economic well-being, but you could design this for a totally different outcome. But let's assume that a community gets potable water, the entire community, right? They've all got access to potable water. What do you have if this was a poor community? You have got a healthier poor community because they have got the potable water, but they are now looking for skills beyond that. Put another way, if you go to a country where there is famine and you give somebody food, that is the immediate need. But once they become healthy, what next? They need to make a living. And therefore, they need an education. They need to be literate. That becomes the next challenge. But then what next? They need to know how to make some money from their learning and so on. So you find that you keep on climbing up the ladder. And therefore, the challenge we face, colleagues, and this is very real even for us, is that we go into communities and we deal with just one challenge. But if you are just dealing with one challenge, how can we impact the state of the community? Therefore, if the community is poor, eventually they will not be able to afford replacing the borehole to meet the user charges. And this is why we are challenged to take our entire thinking to a higher level. But Chris, I do appreciate that. So you can actually design for reduced mortality and then look for everything else that is going to link to that. And that is still good. So the example I gave was not exclusive. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you for
Tusu.
Thank you for your work in
Charlotte
Uganda.
Is going to relay a question from one of our online guests.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have a question from Emmy, and it says, many thanks, Tuzu, for the wonderful presentation. You articulated very well how you do collaborate with the government programs and structures. Could you articulate a little bit further on that specific topic?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think my best example, because I've done a lot in this area, will be in health, not in WASH. Apologies for that. So in health, we have started several initiatives which became national programs. And in our experience, this requires engagement with the Ministry of Health at the earliest stage, at the very earliest stage. So what we normally do, you do what's kind of proof of concept, if you like. So we have got the Uganda Heart Institute that was started by Rotarians. It's now a major initiative. It's actually a hospital now, supported by government, fully funded by government. We started the Mwana Mujimu, or that's the Healthy Child Clinic. That was long ago. For those who remember 3H grants by the Rotary Club of Kampala. And that was fed into the child health training, which is given to expectant mothers. And so on and so forth. We went into the Jaipur limb, and this has been adapted. We went into the cancer, the human papilloma virus. Now there's a major national immunization initiative and so on. And therefore, briefly, Amy, it's about engaging government at the earliest. Because frankly, in a developing country context, only the government is going to have the resources to come in and sustain a major national intervention. Amy, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to everyone. And thanks again, Tusu, for an excellent and informative presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invitation. Really appreciated.
Thank you, Tusu, again, for a great presentation. And thank you, Peter, for the introduction.